Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to use the basics of web development for creating information visualizations. And here we're going to be talking about HTML, CSS, SVG, JavaScript, and the DOM model. So as you can see, actually this outline is part of the HTML, and let's get to it. So let's start recreating this. Basically what I have in here, it's a basic index.html file that we can use for creating our page. Let me empty that completely. And then let's start from scratch. Basically, you will start usually with a template or something like this. I'm using Emmet, a plugin that actually generates the type of code because I'm just too lazy. If you want to know how to set up those things, we have another video that explains those type of things. But in here, we can just start by saying, okay, I'm going to create a header and say this is web development for InfoVis. And then the moment I save in this setup I have in here, I can start seeing the changes here on the page. You can also have, for instance, this title, and in there we can just copy and paste exactly the same thing that we had before. And that is actually going to change, if I can get access to that here, like this part of here that it's telling me what is the title of the page. Okay, so as you can see, something interesting to notice in there is that this is part of a title tag. You can notice that a tag in HTML, it's created by putting anything between less than and greater than, then you put the tag name, and then you have another tag that it's the closing tag. In this case, the closing one is this one, so all of this belongs to that. And all of those are inside this head tag that you can see in here. So it's actually a hierarchy, the HTML. In the head, you put like configurations and information about your page, like for instance, the title. And in the body, like in this part in here, you actually put what you're going to be including in there. Basically, what we want in this case is to start, let's say we want to replicate what we had before. So let's say we are going to create a section. And then inside that section, I'm going to say this is just going to be the outline. That section is going to be semantic and saying that this is a whole group. And then in there, I'm going to create a list with 5 items. So basically, it's a new unordered list with 5 list items. And then in there, I'm going to put HTML and then CSS. I'm going to do a little bit of, SVG here, if I can hit the caps lock, and then JavaScript or ECMAScript as the official name is, and then finally the DOM model. So as you can see, the moment I'm saving, that is going to be represented like those elements. You can also say, like, to look a little bit closer to what we had before, you can say, no, I'm actually want to see these as checkboxes, but we are going to see a little bit more about that later. So for the moment, let's say that you will have another section. And in that section, I'm also going to put another H2. If you notice, this is a header, and this is a header of first level. This is a header of second level, and then we have 2 sections in here. Let's say that I want to put here something that says content, and in there, I'm going to put a div that includes lorem text, that is just basic random text, and I'm going to create 2 of those. So the moment I do that, then you can start seeing that we have 2 of those elements in here, and they are just placed next to each other. And you can continue adding elements, like for instance, let's say we add a final section, and inside that final section, actually instead of calling it section, let's say this is going to be the footer, and in there I'm going to say that this was made by me with tons of love. You can include emojis and everything in there, and as long as you're using an encoding of UTF-8, which is Unicode 8, you can include all of these elements. So the other thing that is interesting in here is that you can also, apart from HTML, you can also put links. For instance, a link is included like this, and then you can say, I want to link to my homepage, for instance, johnguerra.co. And then inside the text, you say what it's going to be displayed as the actual text. Let me make this a little bit bigger so we can see it. So in this case, for instance, we can say, instead of just putting this separate, we can just replace this element And then, as you can see, it's just going to show this part. The other thing you can do is that you can have some little pieces to make it look better, like for instance a horizontal line, or you can say between these two divs I just want to put a breakout line, so it will look better. So you can have these elements. So basically what you do with HTML is that you can create a bunch of elements. They should follow a hierarchical structure, and then it's going to define the semantics of your page, okay? And we're going to refer to different elements in this page in a minute using CSS selectors, okay? So if you want to know other elements that you can use, you just need to search in the MDN for HTML elements. And basically you're going to find elements like this. I recommend you taking a look at always at the Mozilla Developer Network, MDN, because they have like the most up-to-date standard-based description of the HTML standard. So they are going to tell you here all the different elements that you can use, like the footer I was using. You can also use headers. Here are the H1s. You can have a main tag, blah blah blah. So take a look at that for referencing there. Okay. Now, coming back to our example, let's say that I don't like actually the way this looks. So if I want to change the style of this page, then I can just put a style tag. Notice that I'm putting that inside the head. That's usually a place where you put that. And that is going to affect everything inside the page, but you can decide what parts of the page you want to affect. Like for instance, I can say that this is going to have a font family of sans serif. That is going to have a font size of 1.3 relative to the regular M. And now if I actually take this to the basic one, to the standard zoom level, then it looks a little bit more readable. I can say that, for instance, the max width of this is going to be like 100 pixels or something like that, which can be useful, for instance, for reading long texts. And finally, let's say that I want to put a margin of 30 pixels or something. So the key here is that we are using a CSS selector, which is this one. In this case, we are saying I'm going to be affecting like everything that is inside the body. You can also pass other things like headers or sections or things like that. But if you want to be more specific, then you can start saying, like, for instance, remember these two paragraphs we have in here? So let me show you a quick trick that you can use, and it's like adding classes. So you just put an attribute, and notice that I'm putting the attribute inside the less than and greater than. And in that attribute, I'm going to say that this is going to be like a grid. I can put any I want in there. And then for each one of these divs that I have inside there, I'm going to say that this is going to be half. And then let's copy that for this and here. And then now that I have those elements, I can come back here into my CSS, and then I can start addressing those. So I can say anything that is going to be inside the grid is going to have a display or a position, I think, called flex. So flex is the latest standard for displaying elements. Usually divs are going to be displayed as blocks, and they're going to occupy like a whole line, but with flex you can actually display them side by side. Now if I do that, then you can actually see that this is putting first the header and then this div. So actually I'm going to move that from there into this div. That is the one that is aggregating the two halves, okay? So if I put that in there, then you can see that for this specific example, it's distributing the space like half and half in the available space inside the 800 pixels. So I don't know if you noticed, but the fact that I use dot in there, for instance, to access the class grid or the class half, I can also say, like, let's say this is going to be 30% of the available width of the page. And then I can have different elements. I could even add another one in there. Let's say this is 40 or 50. Then it's pretty much similar to what we had before. So whenever you're referring to something that has a class, what you use is dot something, like this one in here. Now, and that can be applied for things that you repeat. Like for instance, I can take this section and then I can copy and paste that. And if I do that, like the other one is going to have exactly the same behavior, okay? And that's because it's classes. Classes or you use classes for elements that appear multiple times in your page. If you have something that only appears once, like for instance, let's say that we want to give something different to this title, and let's say that I want to call that a title, I can also change the header and say, hey, actually my title, and notice I'm using hash h1 because this is the ID. Let's say something simple. Let's say I want to change this to a more jumpy color, like, so I can put that to be something like fire brick, and of course, oh sorry, I made a mistake in here, it should be title. If I wanted to reference that with the h1, it should be like this, h1 alone, or you can say h1 hash title, so that's a combination of only apply to h1s that have the ID title. Usually you can apply that actually to multiple ones, but in this case I'm going only to apply to one. Okay, so we have that, we have links, there's a lot of things like lists, things like that. You can even do tables, but I'm not going to go into that detail. But for the moment, let's say that I also want to put a logo in here or an image. So I do have a file in here that includes the UC Berkeley's logo, so I want to use that one. So what I'm going to get is take that name, and then what I'm going to put in here is that I'm going to put an image, and then I'm going to say that that image is going to be this logo. Notice that I'm using /, which means this is going to be inside the current folder. And then, very important, always add an alternative text that is used for accessibility tools. So we can say here, UC Berkeley logo. And then, just by doing that, we have a nice logo. So we can actually change the properties of these. And let's say I want to put this with a width of only like, I don't know, like 200 pixels. And there are many ways in which you can define sizes. And then we have something more similar to what we want. Okay, so something final in here is that sometimes it's better to organize your files before closing CSS. To organize your files and keeping separate the CSS styles from the actual document. So one way of doing this is that we can actually copy all of this, cut all of this out, and then remove the whole style. And then what you do is that you insert a link, and that it's another tag. It should have the relative of style sheet, and then you say where you're going to put your file. In this case, I'm going to put it into main CSS, and I'm going to create a new file in here. And I'm going to name it main CSS. And I'm just going to put everything in there. And you can notice that the moment I unload this, then I lost my styles. And then when I save it, I bring them back. So it's kind of nice to have them separate, so you can actually even have like more specialized tools for addressing each one of those. You can even do something like having preprocessors and things like that, but we are not going to go into details with that. Okay, so the next one is going to be SVG. Let's say that we want to put the SVG in between these two. So I'm going to put another section in here, and that section is going to be just a chart. And inside that chart, I want to create the SVG tag. Okay, so when you're doing that, then you can notice it starts showing up in here. And then I can start changing attributes from that. I'm going to say that this SVG should use the whole width of the containing element. In this case, I'm not sure if it's going to be 800 or the whole page. But then in here, the way you start drawing inside an SVG is that you start using tags, in this case circle. And I'm going to say that those circles should go, I don't know, like say the position 40 in CX and 40 in Y. And I'm going to say this has a radius of 10. You can notice I have a tool in here called Prettier that it's fixing my standard, adding those quotes in there. And then, as you can see, my circle, it's actually showing as black. And then if you want to change the color for that, in this case, you can change the filling, and then we can say use the standard color used in a lot of visualizations or demos in D3 called steel blue. You can also use other things like hexadecimal representations, like for instance, a very ugly red is going to be something like this, like F for hexa, like 15, and then 0, 0, red, green, blue. Or you can combine different values. There are even tools that you can use for that, like an example. Right click on that element, and then you say inspect, And then when it shows, this is the developer tools. In this case, we are using Chrome. And if you just click in here, if it allows me to, and of course it doesn't, but it should let me change the different elements, and of course it's failing the name on me. So never mind for that for a second. So the other thing is that if you don't want to set it in here, like because for instance, you can just say, I'm going to create another one of this. So you can just put another one of this, and then let's say I'm going to create 4 of them, and then this one is going to be 4, 10, 10, 10, and 40, 10, and 10, 4. Then we have a nice distribution in there. And if you want to change them all at the same time, you can just do that on CSS. So we can actually open my main CSS. And remember that you can reference things by the tag name. So we can just say by circle, and then the fill is going to be steel blue, okay? And that is going to affect all of them. Now, let me tell you another trick that can be very useful with SVG. There is something called a property called viewbox, and with that you can pass 4 coordinates. In this case, I'm going to say it's 116, and that allows me to say that everything inside should be redistributed to occupy like for the whole width. That is going to be 100 pixels or 100 elements wide and 60 elements height. So the nice thing about that is that when I resize, actually the chart resizes and keeps using the space available. So actually it seems in here that it's capped with the 800 pixels that we had in here for the parent element. There's a ton of things that you can learn about how CSS works and how it distributes. Remember that you can always also check the documentation for SVG on the MDN, so you can see other elements that you can use in there. Okay, good. So now we have HTML, we have some CSS, and we also have some, let me try to go back to just the single view. Let's see, we want to also create some JavaScript. So JavaScript is like, if HTML is the language for defining how the page is distributed and what is the contents of it, CSS is the language for saying how it looks, then JavaScript is the language for changing things dynamically inside the page. That's at least how we're going to use it for this. Usually I like putting my scripts, my JavaScript before the body, the closing body. Remember that closing goes with slash in the element. And then in there, you can start writing your whole new language. So I can say in here, alert, hola mundo. If you want to learn a little bit of Spanish, you should. Then it's going to show 109 pop-up in here, just to show something, okay? So actually you shouldn't be doing that because like that's not very well seen, but just to show that you can start writing in there your JavaScript. However, to keep things organized a little bit more, let's do the same trick. We are going to say that this is going to be inside my main JavaScript file. In this case, you don't need to use a different tag, just the same script tag is going to be useful. And then you just need to come in here and create your new file. And then I'm just going to say this is my main JavaScript file. And then in here, I can just start creating my file and start creating different variables and operations. So take a look at also at the MDN introduction to JavaScript so you can see the different objects. One of the things that you can use these the most for is, for instance, for changing attributes. Let's say that you want to change, for instance, the SVG. So there is a variable called document that refers to the whole document, and actually that is referring to the DOM. And you can say inside that document, and I am going to search using a CSS selector. In this case, I'm going to search for the specific SVG. So to make things a little bit easier to understand, let's say that I'm going to put here the index HTML, and then in here the main JavaScript. And then let me get a little bit more space back. So if you want to select this one, you can select just by the element, but let's say that we also want to select it with an ID. So if we have multiple SVGs, we can differentiate between them. I can save this one in here, and then I can actually say I'm going to change the style of this SVG and say it's only going to be 100 pixels. So when you do that, then you can see it actually gets smaller, which is what you're seeing in here. Now, we can make these things fancier even, so adding a little bit of interactions. Let's say that we want to create a little bit of a break in here, another break in here, just to have some separation. And then inside there, I'm going to put a button that says shrink it. So when you do that, I'm going to put an ID here so we can identify that button. And then I can actually select that button using exactly the same trick. Query selector, hash, button shrink. You can also use button, hash, button shrink. And then what I'm going to do with that button shrink is that I'm going to say whenever someone clicks on that, then I'm going to call this function, okay? And that function is just going to be doing this. So what that thing is going to do is that whenever you click on here, then of course I have an error in there. I wonder what can be my mistake. Let's see if I can see anything in here. Perfect. So this one is telling me that it couldn't find, and it's very important, and actually it went a little bit too fast in there, so let me go back. So remember that you should keep your developer tools open all the time for seeing errors, because the browser is going to do its best to try to figure out what the heck you're doing with your code. So whenever you have an error, the only way of seeing that it's in the console. So the easiest way of accessing the console is just by right-clicking on your code or your page and then hitting inspect. And you can also get there to other areas, take the document, check the documentation of the browser you're using. And then in here in the console, this is telling me that there is an error on line 4, actually here, and it's telling me that this thing it's returning null. Maybe one of the reasons for that, maybe I didn't save this, so it seems to be the case. I just saved that, and then it seems to be working. And of course, when I click, it works. It should, as it should. So let's say I want to do something even fancier. So let's go and create another one. I'm actually going to put this in here. This is going to have a label because it's going to have an input. And then in there, I can just put something like this. And then I can say this is going to be my radius. And as you can see, this is going to be that value. And then you can write elements in here and access them through JavaScript. If you want a number, there is a nice input type that you can call type range. And this one has a nice slider that you can actually move very easily. There is another one called number, but unfortunately it still doesn't work by the time of this. It doesn't work very well on cell phones, I think, at least. Notice something else interesting though, rather, is that this is a tag that it's called a self-closing tag because it doesn't have a closing tag, but it's using a slash at the end, and that means that it doesn't have contents, okay? The other thing I'm going to do in here is that I'm going to say this is going to have a min value of 1, max value of, 100, and then a value that is the current one of 10. So when you do that, then it's telling me what is the value. And then something that I think should be included in the input, but it's not, you have to do that manually. And I saw a nice example on the MDN where you use another element called output. So in this one, I'm going to say this is going to be 10. And then I just need another something for identifying this. And then I'm going to say this is going to be a label radius. And if you want to access that in here, then we can just do the same thing. By the way, this is the way of creating a variable, a constant. And then I'm going to say I'm going to access my radius, label radius, and exactly the same trick, query selector, hash, label radius. And then actually we can do a couple of things. You can say, I want to select the input and actually put that in here. And let's make this a little bit bigger so we can see that more clearly. And then we can also do the same thing with the output. So we can just say this is the output. And notice that I'm using a special CSS selector that is this element, and inside that search for an output. So the nice thing about doing that is that I can just go here in my radius and I can say whenever someone does an interaction in here, I actually want you to call a function. You can also go and create a function like this, but actually I don't like this because they take a lot of time to write. So there is another feature in the latest version of JavaScript where you can just replace this with arrow functions like this. And if you only have one line of code, you can even replace it with something like this, which makes it very convenient and close to write, like or short code to write, okay? So in this case, I'm also going to create another one. And in this case, what I'm going to do, this has multiple lines, so I'm going to put brackets in there, is that I'm going first, I'm going to change the value of the inner HTML, and the reason why I know that is because I am the end. The inner HTML of the output is going to be the value of the current value of the input. Okay, so when I do that, if I save here, and then I come here, then now I have that interactive. And let's see if we can make this work even fancier. We can say these are going to be my circles, and I'm not sure if this is going to work. This is going to be document, query, selector, all, I think it's what it's called. And I'm going to select all the circles, okay? And then what I can do is that this is supposed to get me a list. So I can just say on that list for all the elements in there, and then I'm going to put another function in there. And I'm just going to say, and this is going to be, each one of these is going to be a circle. And then what I want to do is that circle dot say, oh, I wonder how I can access that. Maybe property or attribute. Attribute R equals, let's say 20 or something like that. Hopefully we can find that. And then I think I went too fancy. Let's try cheating a little bit in here. This one is telling me that you cannot do that in there. So actually this gives me opportunity to show you how to debug this. Like one easy thing is that you can include this element called debugger in here. So when you do that, and if you go into the sources tab in here, then that is going to allow you to run the code all to that point. Let us open here my main.js file. Let's refresh this page. And then I'm going to move this thing. And then it's telling me that we have that. Then the good thing is that we have a breakpoint. And then I can go here into the console. And then I know I can access, oops, let's do it here instead. Here is my console. You can access the C element. And then let's see if we can find where attribute. I wonder if I have a set attribute, of course. And then I'm going to say the attribute radius is going to be 30. I wonder if that makes any sense. And then, boom, we got it to work. So with that, now we know what is the problem. Attribute.r doesn't work. And that happens for improvising. And then we can say this is going to have a radius of, let's say, whatever inner radius dot value is. And another trick is that this is actually going to be returning probably as a text. So I'm just going to put an extra plus sign in there for it to be converted into a number. That's another trick that is very classical from JavaScript. So I'm just going to run this, going to reload. It's still showing me errors for the fab icon. I don't have an icon, so that's fine. And I should get rid of that debugger. I think I did. So let me refresh here just to see if this thing works. And there we go. So now we have an interactive. So that is an introduction then of web development for JavaScript or for information visualization. Just wrapping up, we did a little bit of HTML, a little bit of CSS, SVG, JavaScript, and DOM manipulation. As you can see, we are doing all of this with JavaScript. We can stay here doing this all day long. Just keep in mind that you need to learn a little bit more about this. So go and search for more information. We are going to send some links for this. And I hope you have enjoyed the video. Thank you.